It's hard to believe, but we are 4 weeks out from the end of our small group series on Ephesians chapter 4 through 6. As you sit in your group today, I want to invite you and implore you to end well. I'd like to ask you to engage these upcoming weeks and make a commitment to give the best of your energy to the material and honestly to the relationships that God has connected you with in your group. Now with that, let's dive into the material in your group. On Sunday, I began the service with a phrase that for most parents elicits a memory and probably an emotion. The phrase, "Daddy, Mommy, watch me." You remember, you'd be hanging out while your kids were playing and all of a sudden they would look at you and say, "Daddy, watch me," and then do something that in their minds was a huge deal. When they got done, what did they do? They would look right at you, smile on their face, and they'd wait for you to say, "Good job. That was amazing." The idea is simple. You were their favorite audience, and they loved doing things not to earn your pleasure, love, or favor. They simply did it because they loved you and loved doing things that brought pleasure to you. As we dive into Ephesians, I want to make the argument that Paul's whole intention in these verses is to move Christ's followers to live for an audience of one, Jesus, and to recognize that everything they do and every relationship that they are in is to be done with Jesus as the audience. So let's read together from Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 to 9. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one whatever good that they do, whether they are slave or free. Masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. So let's begin here. Slavery talked about by Paul here is very different from the slavery we know from our American history books. Slavery had nothing to do with race, and there was no slave class, but instead, slaves were found in all but the highest economic and social strata. Many times, people would sell themselves into slavery to ensure where their next meal was coming from and build a financial foundation for their future. With this in mind, it's safe to say that the best comparison in our context for understanding slavery in Paul's time is the employer-employee relationship in our time, and that is what we want to dive into in our groups. Paul is making clear here to both parties that the coming of Jesus has changed everything for them. Now in the eyes of Jesus, each of them are equals. The relationship has changed between one another, and they both needed to change how they are doing things. They both needed to live with Jesus as their audience. Let's begin with the section on slaves. What we would see today is employees. With the coming of Jesus, the employee or slaves no longer belong to their owners or serve them primarily. They now belong to Jesus and served him. However, Paul gave some specific caveats that apply to us today. Let's look at verse 5. The slave is called to respect and fear and obey their master in the same way they would respect, fear, and obey Jesus. Jesus has changed the relationship, but he has not changed their responsibility. They are still called to honor and respect those they work for on earth, but now they are to do it by choice, to honor Jesus. In verse 6, Paul speaks of the slave's motivation for doing. In Paul's time, slaves were notorious for being lazy and lying to get their way and only working hard when their master was in sight. Paul shifts that. In essence, he is telling them to work hard all the time because their true master and Lord Jesus is always watching. The implication is clear for us. Everything we do at all times is to be done as well as possible to honor Jesus. I serve my master, I serve my employer, and do my job as if my employer is Jesus and everything I do is for him. Verse 7 and 8, Paul makes it clear that everything we do has Jesus in mind. We are not serving humans, we are serving Jesus. And no matter how menial the task seems, if viewed properly, even if it seems like slave labor, we must do it with the final judgment in mind, which simply means Jesus is our audience. Everything we do, big and small, has kingdom implications, and internally we're always saying, Jesus, watch this. The end result for us is clear. Our jobs and our role in the culture do not determine who we are. We live in, to, and for Christ in all we do. Moreover, our value and identity, they don't come from our circumstances, they come from Jesus. By directing all our actions to Christ, all of life, even the most mundane parts, is elevated to meaning and service to God. As an example, consider this. Imagine a teacher. They teach material, they give tests, they go home. Everyone would agree that the teacher had fulfilled his or her contract, but would it really be enough? The teachers that would look like Christ would see their responsibility increase to nurturing souls, caring for the well-being of each child, and investing into the future of each child for the sake of honoring Jesus. The idea as a teacher, Jesus, watch me, I'm going to do this for you. Paul then shifts to the role of the master employer. In verse 9, Paul tells masters and employers they must treat their slaves or employees in our context in the same way that they would treat Jesus. Masters, historically speaking, had used fear and threats to motivate their slaves to action, but this is not an option anymore. They would need to treat them with respect and fear as if they were speaking to the Lord. The implication is clear. We are all slaves to God. He is Lord, and we submit all that we have to Him. Slave or master, employer or employee. Everything we do is for Him. Every person we relate to, it's as if we are relating to Jesus. Every job we do, we're ultimately doing it for Him. As you dive into your groups, you will spend time looking at how you relate to those who have responsibility over you and how you relate to those that you are responsible for. Be honest about your struggles, your frustrations, and where God may be calling you to shift in your view of Jesus as your audience in all things. Have a great group, and look forward to seeing you next week.